When a young boy woke from a coma, the first words out of his mouth sent chills down the nurse's spine. What seemed like a tragic fall at first took a sinister turn as the pieces unraveled, revealing a dark truth, one that put his life and his family in unimaginable danger. This is the story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Tom Porter did not remember the first moments after he emerged from the darkness. All he knew was that, one instant, the world had been a silent void, and the next, hospital lights glared overhead, and he tasted antiseptic on his tongue. He lay in a bed, with crisp sheets tugged neatly around him, as if the staff worried he might tumble over the edge again. Nurses hovered near the doorway, whispering that a boy had finally come to. But Tom's first recollection, the one that would haunt him for months to come, was of a single sentence escaping his own lips before he even knew he was speaking. "Someone pushed me." He had been told later that this statement sent a jolt through the entire wing. Nurses exchanged startled glances, aware that doctors had presumed Tom's fall down his family's grand staircase was an accident. They had chalked it up to a misstep, maybe a careless adolescent slip. Yet, as he uttered those words, the surgical ward fell silent. The nurse on duty, a woman named Harriet, nearly dropped her tray of supplies. For a brief moment, Tom's heart monitor beeped in a frantic staccato that punctuated the tension in the air. Tom, of course, did not realize any of this at the time. He had no conscious understanding that his words were shocking. He was disoriented, hardly able to distinguish between the bright illusions of half-remembered dreams and the sterile reality of the hospital room. All he had was an overwhelming feeling that something terrible had happened, a horror overshadowing the pain in his battered limbs and the dull throb at the back of his skull. A day passed, then another, and Tom's foggy mind began to clear. He noticed how Harriet kept looking at him with pity. He caught glimpses of orderlies who spoke in hushed tones every time they passed his room. He overheard a junior doctor say, "He claims it wasn't an accident." The word "claims" stood out to him. He wondered if adults would believe him, or if they would brush off his memories as a child's confusion. After all, he was only 14, not quite old enough to be taken entirely seriously in a world run by grown-ups who suspected imagination around every corner. And how certain was he anyway? Had he actually been pushed? Or could his broken memories be playing tricks on him? In those early days, Tom's body was weak. A cast wrapped around his right arm, and a tight bandage circled his head. The hospital physical therapist, a gentle man in his 50s, coaxed Tom to sit up, stand, and take the first trembling steps across the room. Each shuffle along the polished floor reminded Tom of the moment he lost his footing on the stairs, except his scattered thoughts kept insisting it had not been his choice to step wrong. The words haunted him. "Someone pushed me." It was during one of these sessions that Detective John Stokes first arrived to speak with him. Tom had no warning that a detective would come at all. Usually, the policeman assigned to a so-called domestic accident was either a local officer or a board clerk who took a few notes, for formality's sake. But Stokes seemed genuinely invested. He asked how Tom felt, in a tone that suggested he was far more than a passive bystander. He had a lined face, dark hair going gray at the temples, and a stance that radiated quiet confidence, like a man who had witnessed countless tragedies yet never lost empathy. "Tom," Stokes said, his voice low enough to avoid alarming the nurses, "I know you've been through a lot. The hospital staff told me what you said when you woke up." Tom stared at him, his knees threatening to buckle from exhaustion, but the physical therapist was right there, supporting him gently by the elbow. "I said someone pushed me," Tom managed. "That's all I remember. But that's true. I feel it in my gut. I didn't just fall." Stokes nodded, his expression grave. "We have to be careful. The official report stated it was an accident. No forced entry at your home, no sign of intruders, and no one witnessed anything." He paused. "Your Uncle Nick Johnson told the police it must have been a misstep." "Uncle Nick," Tom murmured, but the name felt foreign in his mouth. His parents had been gone for years, and Nick was the only living relative who had stepped in to care for him, or at least to manage the estate. The man had always treated Tom politely enough. Or had he? Tom's recollection felt jumbled. I don't know, he finally admitted, tears of frustration pooling in his eyes. Stokes placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, voice gentle. Take your time. Memory can be fragile after a trauma. But if there's any truth to your words, we'll need to investigate carefully. In the days that followed, Tom's physical strength returned inch by inch. The hospital staff encouraged him to eat more, to move around more, but it was the detective's occasional visits that gave Tom a sense of purpose. Stokes asked about Tom's relationship with his uncle, about the night of the fall. More than once, Stokes offered quiet reminders that Tom should not force his memories. It was better to let them surface naturally. Yet Tom felt a building pressure inside him. If no one believed him, if he couldn't recall everything, how would he ever prove that the fall had been more than a terrible mishap? One evening, just before Harriet was about to check his vitals, Tom found himself staring out the window. Rain pattered against the glass. The distant city lights twinkled with a false serenity. In the reflection, he saw his own weary face, but behind his image, it seemed he could almost glimpse another figure. A flicker of a memory made him gasp. The moment a hand, someone's strong hand, pressed against his back. A shadowy figure at the top of the staircase. Then a sensation of weightlessness, terror, and pain. His heart pounded as he clutched the windowsill for balance. He whispered. Someone was definitely there. The next morning, Harriet noticed Tom's agitation and tried to comfort him with a pep talk. You're going to be okay, she said, adjusting the pillows around him. Just focus on healing. Tom forced a smile, though a part of him wanted to scream that he needed more than just healing. He needed answers, and he suspected the danger was not over. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that phantom figure standing behind him on the stairs. By the end of his second week in the hospital, the doctors believed Tom stable enough to go home under supervision. Home, ironically, meant returning to the very estate where he had been injured, to the grand old house with its columned facade and shadowy halls. He did not relish the thought. Nor did he trust the idea of returning to that place while his memory was still hazy. But he had no choice. He was 14, after all. His Uncle Nick was his guardian, and the estate was his rightful residence, at least until he turned 18. Uncle Nick arrived to pick him up one humid afternoon. Tom remembered the smell of disinfectant trailing him through the hospital corridor, and the squeak of the wheelchair Harriet insisted on pushing him in until they reached the main exit. Nick offered Tom a brisk smile that never quite reached his eyes. It's good to see you out of that bed, Nick said, his voice a tad too bright. I've had the staff prepare your room. You'll be comfortable. Tom's gaze dropped to Nick's polished shoes. The man was impeccably dressed, as usual, with neatly combed hair and an expression of forced concern. Tom's chest tightened, but he merely nodded. Inside, he felt an inexplicable dread forming. He could not pinpoint whether it was an actual memory or simply the fear that sprang from not knowing what happened. All he did know was that his father's estate was now Nick's domain. Tom felt more like a visitor than the heir to the property. Once inside the black sedan, Nick hummed quietly. The city traffic crawled past them. Tom stared out the window, noticing the world outside had kept spinning while he was unconscious. Billboards were replaced, seasonal decorations appeared in shop windows, and it seemed entire days had vanished from Tom's life. Nick started asking about the hospital food, whether the doctors treated him well. Typical caretaker questions. Tom answered with half-hearted murmurs, scanning Nick's face for any sign of tension. But Nick was a practiced mask-wearer, and Tom gleaned nothing from the man's polite chatter. The estate loomed like a memory made concrete. It was older than Tom's grandparents, a testament to an era when building something meant stone foundations and wrought iron gates. The driveway curved under tall oak trees, their branches swaying overhead. The trunk of each tree was thick enough for a child to hide behind. Tom recalled once playing hide-and-seek with a caretaker's daughter, only to be scolded by Nick for scuffing the bark. Or was that memory real? It felt blurred now, as if it belonged to a dream. When the car finally stopped, a housekeeper in a neat uniform opened the door for them. She welcomed Tom with an overly formal greeting. Inside, the entry hall was cool, lit by a chandelier that cast shifting patterns on the marble floor. Tom's eyes flicked to the grand staircase in the distance, the one that spiraled elegantly toward the upper floors. The sight sent a jolt through him. He felt his pulse quicken, and for a moment, he saw a vision of himself tumbling, the steps rushing toward him, the world spinning. He tasted fear. He had to steady himself against a nearby table. "Easy, Tom," Nick said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Take it slow. You've been in bed for a while." Tom nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll be fine," he said in a hoarse whisper. But his gaze never left that staircase, the silent witness to his tragedy. Even in broad daylight, it seemed haunted. The days that followed were a study in subtle tension. Nick insisted that Tom rest, and he restricted Tom's movements around the estate. For safety. A new caretaker, Harold, was introduced, a gruff man with stooped shoulders and a watchful gaze. "If you need anything," Nick told Tom, "just ask Harold. He'll fetch it for you." Tom soon discovered that asking Harold often meant waiting a long time or receiving incomplete answers. For instance, when Tom asked about any security camera footage from the night he fell, Harold claimed ignorance. "Don't know anything about that, lad," Harold said, then vanished down a corridor. The next day, when Tom asked if his father's old study was still locked, Harold shrugged. "Could be, not sure. Why do you ask?" The caretaker did not seem outright hostile, but he guarded information as though it were gold. Feeling increasingly isolated, Tom turned inward. He tried to recall the events leading up to his fall. He remembered tucking in his shirt, heading downstairs for some reason. Was it late at night? Early morning? Why had no one been around to see it happen? The more he tried, the more his head hurt. Whenever he pressed too hard, the memory eluded him like water slipping through his fingers. Detective Stokes visited the estate one afternoon, explaining that he wanted to make sure Tom was adjusting well. Tom led him to a small sitting room, one less opulent than the main drawing room but still furnished with plush chairs and heavy drapes that blocked out the daylight. Nick joined them, his posture stiff. There was no overt hostility on Nick's part, but Tom sensed an undercurrent of disapproval at having a detective snooping around. "So, you're here about Tom's accident?" Nick asked, leaning against the tall-backed chair near the fireplace. "I appreciate your concern, Detective, but the doctors agreed it was likely just a misstep." Stokes smiled thinly. "I'm simply following up. Tom mentioned some concerns. He feels he may have been pushed." Nick's eyebrows rose with a practiced show of surprise. "Pushed? You never told me that, Tom." Tom shifted uncomfortably. He did not want to appear weak in front of the detective, but the weight of his uncle's stare pinned him. Well, it's just a feeling," Tom stammered. "It's not necessarily." Nick waved a dismissive hand. "It's understandable Tom might be confused. Waking from a coma, all those medications, the trauma. Sometimes the mind can fill in blanks with illusions. I'm sure it's no one's fault." Stokes let the silence hang. Tom found himself wishing the detective would challenge Nick more directly, but perhaps that was not Stokes's style. Instead, Stokes nodded and asked if it would be all right to speak privately with Tom for a few minutes. Nick obliged, stepping out of the sitting room with a measured courtesy. The moment Nick was gone, Tom felt the tension drain from his shoulders. "Tom," Stokes said softly, leaning forward, "I need you to trust your instincts. If you have any more memories, flashes, details, anything that might indicate who was behind you when you fell, you must let me know." Tom swallowed. "I get these nightmares," he confessed. "I see a figure tall, with broad shoulders maybe. But it's a silhouette. I can't see the face. I wish I could." Stokes nodded. "You'll remember more in time. Meanwhile, I'll see if the staff recalls hearing or seeing anything suspicious that night. Your uncle is the one who found you, correct?" Tom frowned. "That's what he says. He claimed I must have tripped. He called the ambulance." But I don't remember him picking me up or anything. Stokes's jaw tightened slightly. I'll keep digging. For now, you focus on recovering. Be careful who you trust. Tom watched him go, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. At least someone believed him enough to keep looking. But as he wandered the halls of the estate later that day, he wondered if he had already said too much. The staff seemed guarded, and Nick's polite tone carried an undercurrent of watchfulness that made Tom uneasy. Late one evening, Tom was restless. He could not sleep, haunted by half-formed recollections. He decided to explore the house. If he was to learn the truth, perhaps he could stumble upon something that might jog his memory. Tiptoeing out of his bedroom, he followed the corridor to the older wing of the house, a place rarely used. The floors creaked, and the air was stale as though no one had opened a window there in years. He found a locked door. Curiosity flared. He recognized it as the door to his father's study, though it had been sealed off for a long while, supposedly for renovations. Strange, since no repairs ever seemed to take place there. He tested the knob, but it refused to budge. Frustration welled up, so he pressed his ear to the wood, listening. Silence. Yet, as he started to turn away, he thought he heard a shuffling sound on the other side. A chill ran down his spine. He turned back, poised to knock, but the idea of who might be inside made him hesitate. If he alerted the occupant, it could be dangerous. Then again, it might be the caretaker rummaging around. Torn between caution and the desire for answers, Tom eventually left, deciding he would ask Harold about the locked study the following morning. Sleep did not come easily. In his bed, Tom tossed and turned, the blankets tangling around his legs. He dreamed of a ghostly figure creeping through the corridor, entering the locked study. In the dream, the figure discovered a dusty ledger with secrets scrawled in the margins. Tom tried to read it, but the letters blurred. The figure turned to him, its face contorting in anger. Then Tom was tumbling, always tumbling, until he woke in a cold sweat, heart hammering against his ribcage. The next morning, the estate was bathed in golden sunlight, as though nature cared nothing for the boy's turmoil. Over breakfast in the dining room, where a long table stretched beneath a high ceiling, Nick read the newspaper in silence. Tom pushed his scrambled eggs around the plate, his appetite non-existent. At last, he cleared his throat. "Uncle Nick," he said, keeping his tone casual, "why is Father's old study still locked?" Nick barely glanced up from the newspaper. "It's never been properly cleaned out. A lot of old junk in there. I didn't want you to deal with it, what with your recovery and all. It's my father's possessions, though," Tom ventured. "Maybe I want to look through them. Maybe I need to see what's in there." Nick sighed, folding the paper neatly. "We can arrange it eventually," he said. "But not now. You should focus on getting better. It's not good for you to dredge up painful memories when you're still healing." Tom's jaw tightened. He sensed a dismissal in Nick's tone, a finality that brooked no argument. Still, Tom could not let it go so easily. It doesn't make sense to keep it locked indefinitely. This is my house too." Nick's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained calm. "It is," he said slowly. "But I'm the adult here, and your guardian. I decide what's best for you. Let's not argue about it." With that, Nick rose, leaving Tom alone at the table. Tom glared at the untouched eggs, frustration boiling inside him. The conversation had only heightened his suspicion. He was certain Nick had no intention of letting him into that study any time soon. Which meant that if Tom wanted to see it, he would have to do so in secret. Later that day, Tom searched the house for Harold, intending to press him for information. He found the caretaker polishing silver in a cramped storage room. "You again," Harold muttered, glancing at Tom with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "Shouldn't you be resting?" "I'm fine," Tom insisted. "I wanted to ask about the old study, my father's old study. Have you been in there recently?" Harold's cloth paused on a tarnished candlestick. He shrugged. "Not my place to rummage through that. Mr. Johnson keeps it locked. Says there's no need to open it up unless he says so." Tom decided to push. You've never had to go in there for anything? No cleaning, no repairs? Harold resumed polishing. Not in my time. I only started working here after your accident, lad. Can't say I've ever set foot inside. Tom studied the man's expression. Was Harold telling the truth or stonewalling him? It was impossible to tell. Still, it was suspicious that Nick had replaced the old caretaker right after Tom's fall. The timing seemed too neat. That evening, Detective Stokes called Tom on the house phone. I've been speaking with some of the people who worked here before, Stokes said. They're not easy to find. A few left the estate abruptly. Tom's pulse quickened. Do you know why? They gave vague excuses, moving, health reasons, family matters. But it's odd that so many staff members departed around the same time. It might be nothing, or it might be something. I want to check it out further, Tom whispered, mindful of the echoing corridors. Uncle Nick replaced almost everyone after my accident. There's a caretaker now named Harold, but I'm not sure I trust him. Stokes's voice turned thoughtful. Be cautious. If there's something big at play, the last thing we want is for you to be in danger. Let me handle the heavier investigation. You just stay safe. Tom hung up, feeling a mixture of gratitude and impatience. He appreciated Stokes's concern, but Tom's gut told him that the hidden truth behind his parents' disappearance and his accident was woven into the very walls of this estate. If he waited passively, might vital evidence vanish? In the following days, Tom pretended to follow doctor's orders. He stayed in his room, did his prescribed physical exercises, and feigned a subdued demeanor around Nick. Meanwhile, he quietly mapped out the estate in his head, recalling every nook and hallway from childhood explorations. He wanted to figure out a way to break into his father's study. He surmised that the old caretaker, the one who had known the house intimately, might have left behind a spare key. But that caretaker was gone, no forwarding address. One night, Tom made another excursion. He slipped into the corridor near the locked study. With a small flashlight in hand, he had found it in a desk drawer. He examined the door's lock. It looked robust, but not impossible for a skilled hand to pick, not that Tom had any experience in lockpicking. He gently tested the hinges. They squeaked but seemed well-oiled. Perhaps Nick had been in and out of there more than he claimed. Just as Tom was about to press his ear to the door again, he heard footsteps. He killed the flashlight and flattened himself against the wall, heart pounding. The corridor was dark, lit only by the moonlight filtering through a distant window. He stood perfectly still, breath caught in his throat. The footsteps grew louder, then paused. Tom stifled a gasp. He sensed someone's presence close by, as though a watchful figure was scanning the corridor. After an agonizing moment, the footsteps retreated, fading back into silence. Tom stayed motionless for a full minute, adrenaline coursing through him, before daring to edge away. He returned to his room, thoughts racing. Someone had been patrolling the halls, or maybe coming from inside the study. Could it have been Nick? Or Harold? The sense of creeping danger was almost palpable. Morning arrived, bright and deceptively normal. Nick announced he had business in town and might be gone most of the day. Tom seized the opportunity to comb through the rest of the house. He rummaged through drawers in the library, rummaged in dusty closets, anywhere a spare key might be hidden. Eventually, in a seldom-used sitting room, he found a box of old keys stashed in a trunk. Most were unlabeled. Tom pocketed several that appeared like they might fit older locks, determined to test them later. Meanwhile, Detective Stokes managed to contact an old housemaid who once worked in the estate. She agreed to talk to Tom privately, so Stokes arranged a meeting at a small cafe on the edge of town. With Nick away, Tom slipped out, claiming he was going for a walk. In reality, he hopped on a bus and traveled 30 minutes to the cafe. His heart hammered with anticipation as he slid into a booth by the window. The maid, an older woman named Mrs. Fletcher, looked nervous. Her hands trembled on her cup of tea. "I shouldn't be here," she said in a hushed voice. "I signed an agreement never to discuss estate matters." Tom tried to keep his voice steady. "Please, Mrs. Fletcher. I just want to know what happened to me, and maybe to my parents." She flinched at the mention of his parents. "I was a maid there when you were a little boy. I remember you toddling about. Your mother was so kind." Her eyes grew watery. "We were all shocked when your parents vanished. Mr. Johnson told us they left on a sudden trip. But they never came back." Tom's heart ached. "Did you suspect anything else?" Mrs. Fletcher lowered her gaze. "There were rumors. Some of us thought your uncle had secrets. But we didn't dare speak of it. He threatened to ruin anyone who pried too deeply." Tom swallowed. "So you left soon after my accident?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "He told me it was best if I found employment elsewhere. He offered a generous severance if I stayed quiet. I never saw any direct proof that he harmed your parents. I only know that your father used to keep a journal in his study. He wrote in it every night. If you want the truth, that journal might be the key." Tom felt a jolt. The locked study. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I promise I won't let him get away with anything if he's guilty." Mrs. Fletcher looked frightened at that. She squeezed Tom's hand. "Be very careful," she whispered. "He's dangerous when cornered." They parted ways soon after, Mrs. Fletcher glancing around as though expecting someone to leap out of the shadows. Tom's stomach churned. He realized that everything he feared might be real, that Nick Johnson, the man who now ran the estate, might have orchestrated the disappearance of Tom's parents, and possibly tried to silence Tom by pushing him down the stairs. The notion was so horrifying that Tom's mind reeled. Returning to the estate, Tom was grateful Nick was still out. He rushed straight to the locked study door, the stolen keys jingling in his pocket. If the journal was inside, it could hold the truth about what happened to his parents. He tried the first key, no luck. The second key fit partway but wouldn't turn. The third key caught in the lock. Slowly Tom twisted. There was a click, and the door swung open a crack. A surge of triumph shot through Tom's veins. He had done it. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight that managed to squeeze past heavy curtains. The study smelled of old books and disuse. Tom's heart pounded as he scanned the shelves, the desk, the scattered furniture. A layer of dust coated most surfaces, but some spots seemed recently disturbed, as if someone had rifled through them. Carefully, he opened drawers, sifting through old papers. He found receipts, business contracts, letters, but nothing that looked like a personal journal. He circled to the back of the desk. The bottom drawer was locked. After fumbling with the ring of keys, he found one that opened it. Inside lay a worn leather-bound notebook. Dust coated the cover, but Tom wiped it away. The front read, "Property of Robert Porter, Tom's father." Hands trembling, he began to turn the pages. The entries chronicled mundane details at first: appointments, property upkeep, hints of a planned trip. But as Tom read on, the entries took a darker turn. His father wrote about Nick Johnson pressuring him to sign over portions of the estate. There were references to suspicious financial dealings, large sums of money unaccounted for, and arguments between the two men. The last few entries hinted at threats. Robert Porter seemed to suspect that Nick was capable of unspeakable acts. The very last entry read, "I fear for my life and for my wife's safety. Nick is not the man he pretends to be. If anything happens to us, please know we never left Tom by choice." Tom's breath caught in his throat. Tears blurred his vision. Here was evidence, his father's own words, confirming that Nick's involvement with the family business had turned malevolent. And worse, it pointed to the possibility that Nick was behind his parents' disappearance. Shaking, Tom closed the journal and clutched it to his chest. He had to show this to Detective Stokes immediately. This was exactly what they needed. Suddenly, a noise in the corridor made him freeze. A muffled thump. Then quiet footsteps. Tom's mind raced. If he was caught here with the journal, it would seal his fate. He quickly slid the notebook under his shirt, holding it tight against his stomach. The door handle rattled. Tom's entire body tensed. Someone was trying to enter. When the door inched open, Tom pressed himself behind the tall bookshelf. A figure stepped inside, and though the curtain's gloom obscured the details, Tom recognized the shape of the caretaker, Harold. The caretaker held a small lantern, scanning the room as if searching for something, or someone. Tom stayed perfectly still, praying that Harold would not see him. Harold moved deeper into the study, stepping closer to the desk. "Strange," Tom heard him mutter under his breath. "I could have sworn this was locked." The caretaker set the lantern down and rummaged through drawers, frustration evident in his movements. When he stood, he exhaled sharply. "Where is that blasted notebook?" A new wave of terror coursed through Tom. Harold was clearly looking for the journal. Perhaps Nick had sent him, suspecting that Tom would try to break in. Tom's grip tightened on the leather-bound book. He had to get out, but any movement risked drawing Harold's attention. After a tense minute of rummaging, Harold cursed under his breath. Then he picked up the lantern, turned, and walked out. Tom waited, counting the seconds as the footsteps receded. Only when he was sure that Harold had left the corridor did he slip quietly from his hiding place and dart back out into the hall, carefully locking the study behind him. He hoped the caretaker would think it was still locked from the outside. Tom made it to his bedroom undetected. He placed the journal in a drawer under his socks, then sank onto his bed, heart thumping. He had never felt so alive and terrified all at once. He needed a plan. He had to get the journal to Stokes, but if Harold was searching for it, Nick might already suspect something. Tom had to be smarter. He had to be ready for the possibility that Nick would do anything to keep the journal under wraps. He decided to call Stokes that evening, but the detective's phone went straight to an answering service. Tom left a coded message saying he had found a very important paper and needed to meet in person. Then he tried to act normal for the rest of the day, though his nerves were on edge. Every time he passed a staff member, he wondered if they too were watching him on Nick's behalf. He saw Harold once in the corridor, the man's face set in a scowl. They exchanged no words, but Harold's gaze lingered on Tom as though sizing him up. That night, as Tom lay in bed, he realized he could not simply wait for Stokes to rescue him. The detective might be tied up with other cases, or worse, might be in danger himself if Nick had connections within the local authorities. Tom resolved that tomorrow he would slip out of the estate with the journal as soon as he found a safe chance. He would deliver it to Stokes's office if he had to walk the entire way. But first, he needed some sleep, though that, too, proved elusive. Every creak in the old house set his nerves on edge, and he half expected Harold to burst into his room, rummaging for the stolen evidence. Morning arrived in a haze of dew and chirping birds. Tom dressed quickly, slipping the journal into a backpack. He was about to head downstairs when he heard raised voices from the direction of the foyer. He tiptoed closer, peeking around the corner. Nick Johnson was speaking on the telephone, his tone clipped and furious. "I don't care what it costs," Nick hissed. "I want that problem handled. If the boy tries anything, I expect results." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Then he growled, "Yes, I'm sure. Make it happen." A chill froze Tom in place. There was no doubt Nick was talking about him. This was confirmation that Nick was orchestrating some plan to keep Tom in check, maybe worse. Tom's first instinct was to bolt out of the house right then. But he noticed Harold standing nearby, arms folded, blocking the main door. Tom retreated. He could not risk confronting them directly. They were likely expecting him to do something rash. He needed an alternate exit. Quietly, he remembered there was a narrow servant's stairwell behind the kitchen that led to a small courtyard. If he could make it that far without drawing attention, he might slip out. Holding his breath, he walked the corridors with light steps. The estate felt larger and more ominous than ever. Every portrait on the wall, every statue in the alcove seemed to watch him with silent judgment. In the kitchen, the cook was busy slicing vegetables. She glanced up, startled to see Tom. "Oh, Master Tom. Good morning. Didn't expect you so early." Tom mustered a polite smile. "I just want some air," he said, trying to sound casual. He was grateful the cook had no particular loyalty to Nick that he knew of. She had always been kind. She nodded, returning to her task. Tom made for the side door that opened onto the courtyard. Once outside, he took a long, calming breath. The air smelled of wet grass and distant pine. The courtyard was bordered by tall hedges. He saw no obvious sign of Harold or Nick. Keeping to the shadows, Tom circled the estate until he reached the gate that led to the main road. Normally, a staff member would open it for visitors, but it was locked from the inside. Tom rummaged in his pocket for a gate key he had stolen from the same trunk as the study key. His hands were sweating, and it took him 3 tries to get the key into the lock. With a click, the gate swung open. Tom slipped out and headed down the road, backpack clutched tight. He felt a surge of relief. Now he just had to get to Detective Stokes' station or house. He recalled that the detective's official precinct was about 2 miles into town. He could manage that walk. Then he'd hail a bus or a taxi if needed. The main objective was to deliver the journal safely. He had no doubt Nick and his associates would be looking for him as soon as they discovered he was gone. He managed half a mile before a black car pulled alongside him. For a moment, terror flared. He thought it might be Harold. But to his shock, the window rolled down to reveal Detective Stokes himself at the wheel. Stokes looked tense. "Tom, get in," he said. "We need to talk." Tom exhaled a shaky breath, climbing into the passenger seat. "I tried calling you," he murmured, rummaging in his backpack. "I found my father's journal, Detective. It's full of evidence about Nick. He basically threatened my dad, pressured him for money, and—" Stokes held up a hand to slow him. "I've been following up leads. I found a paper trail that ties your uncle to some large financial transfers just before your parents disappeared. This journal could be the missing link we need to prove foul play." Tom nodded eagerly, handing the journal over. "Mrs. Fletcher told me about it. She was afraid. Everyone's afraid of him. He has so much power, or at least he acts like it." Stokes flipped through the pages, eyes darkening. "This is significant, Tom. I'm going to make copies, keep the original safe. We'll build a solid case so no one can bury it." Relief washed through Tom. For the first time since he woke from his coma, he felt genuine hope. "But, Detective," he said, voice quivering, "I'm worried about what Nick might do. I overheard him on the phone, saying he wants me handled. I think he might come after me." Stokes nodded gravely. "We'll take precautions. The problem is, if we move against him prematurely, he might destroy other evidence or pull strings to obstruct the investigation. We need more than a journal. We need living witnesses, proof of financial misconduct, a clear motive. The good news is, I've spoken to a couple of ex-staff members who are willing to testify, provided we can guarantee their safety." Tom blinked. "So, there's a chance we can take him down legally?" "Yes," Stokes said, "but it won't happen overnight. We need to be methodical. When we present our case, it must be airtight. Otherwise, Nick's lawyers will tear it apart. Right now, my biggest concern is your safety." "I can't go back to the estate," Tom said. "Not now. Not after he's made it clear he wants me out of the picture." Stokes drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. "I might be able to place you in protective custody, but that requires a formal procedure. If Nick is as connected as I suspect, he'll know where you are. Another idea is to keep you somewhere unofficial, like a friend's place." Tom swallowed, dread creeping into his thoughts. "The only real friend I have is, well, I guess I don't have many friends. I was never close with my neighbors, and I was homeschooled for a while." Stokes gave him a sympathetic look. "Then I'll watch over you until I can arrange something more secure. But I warn you, it might not be comfortable. I'm a single man, no fancy house. I just have a modest place out on Maple Street." "That's more than enough," Tom said, relieved. Stokes pulled away from the curb, driving them into a quieter part of town. He explained on the way that he had to be careful not to draw attention. Nick Johnson's influence might extend to local officials or even some folks at the precinct. Stokes had a few trusted colleagues, but not enough to guarantee that no leaks would occur. The detective's tone carried a weight of caution that Tom had never encountered before. It was as though every shadow on the sidewalk could hide a spy. They arrived at Stokes's humble bungalow, a small single-story house with a neat lawn and a rickety fence. Tom followed Stokes inside, noting the stacks of case files piled on the coffee table, the faint smell of old coffee lingering in the air. Stokes's living room was cluttered with books and boxes labeled with cryptic abbreviations. Tom perched on the edge of the couch, his mind still spinning with the magnitude of it all. "You can sleep in the guest room," Stokes said, pointing down a narrow hallway. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." Tom's legs felt rubbery. He nodded, standing up to check out the small room. It contained a single bed, a closet, and a bedside table. Despite the Spartan decor, it felt immeasurably safer than the estate at that moment. He set his backpack down, realizing he was still clutching the feeling of dread like a cloak he could not remove. Over the next few hours, Stokes left him mostly alone, presumably to make calls, gather resources, or start scanning pages of the journal. The detective also stepped out briefly to grab some takeout. Tom ate in silence, his appetite small, but the warm food soothed his nerves a bit. He found himself flicking through the local news channels on a battered old television, half expecting to see some sensational headline about Nick. But there was nothing. Life in the outside world continued undisturbed. Stokes returned to the living room, looking thoughtful. "I've contacted a couple of staff members who used to work for your family. One is willing to meet tomorrow night, share what she knows about your parents' final days in the estate. If we can get enough corroborating testimony, along with the journal, we can formally request an arrest warrant for Nick Johnson." Tom swallowed a mouthful of lukewarm noodles. "Then what? What if he has powerful allies? He might slip away or post bail." Stokes tapped a pen against a notepad. "We'll do our best to make the charges stick. If your father's disappearance is classed as a homicide or a kidnapping, bail might be very high or denied altogether. But we need strong evidence. Without a body or a direct confession, it's tricky. Still, the financial crimes alone, embezzlement, fraud, could keep him detained if we prove them." Hope flared in Tom, but so did anxiety. "Is there a chance my parents are still alive? Could Nick have kept them somewhere?" Stokes's face softened. "I won't lie. It's been years since they vanished. The odds aren't good. But I promise you, if there's even the slightest possibility, we'll follow it." A tiredness overwhelmed Tom. He muttered a quiet, "Thank you," before retreating to the guest room. The weight of the day's revelation settled on his shoulders. He wanted to believe that his parents might still be out there, that Nick had simply hidden them away. But the more he thought about the final entry in his father's journal, the more he sensed the grim reality. Nick had threatened them. If they had refused to comply, who knew what he had done? That night, Tom slept fitfully. Each time he drifted off, nightmares of the estate's dark corridors and the locked study returned. He dreamed of a man's silhouette looming over him on the staircase, a hand pushing him into the void. He dreamed of Nick's cold eyes. Then he dreamed of his father and mother, reaching out to him from some unknown place, their voices muffled by distance. Morning brought no relief. Tom woke to find Stokes already on the phone, engaged in a heated debate with someone from the precinct. Tom lingered in the hallway, listening. "He's not safe there," Stokes insisted. "We have reason to believe the caretaker is armed." He stopped, cast a glance at Tom, and corrected himself. "Potentially dangerous, I mean." "Yes. No, I don't have direct evidence they're threatening him physically. But it's implied." Another pause. "No, I won't bring him in for official protective custody if there's a risk that Johnson has ears in your office." Tom's stomach twisted. He realized Stokes was walking a tightrope, trying to keep him hidden while building the case. He almost felt guilty for dragging the detective into such a complicated situation, but he reminded himself that none of this was truly his fault. Nick had set these wheels in motion. When Stokes finally hung up, he offered Tom a weary smile. "Bureaucracy. They don't like me doing things off the record. But I can't risk your safety by going through normal channels just yet." Tom nodded. "I understand. What's our next move?" Stokes rubbed his eyes. I'm going to collect more statements, see if I can gather any official documents, like your father's will, property deeds, bank records. If Nick forced or forged signatures, that's a serious crime. Can I help? Tom asked, though he felt ill-equipped to do anything more than wait. Not today, Stokes said kindly. You need rest, and you need to stay out of sight. The best thing you can do is lie low. Tom bristled at the thought of lying low, but he recognized the logic. He spent the day pacing around Stokes's small house, flicking through television channels, or trying to read. His mind would not settle. That evening, Stokes went out to meet the ex-staff member who promised to talk, leaving Tom alone with instructions to lock every door and window. The loneliness pressed down on him, but he understood it was for the greater good. Hours passed, with no word from Stokes. Finally, around midnight, Stokes returned, face grim. He tossed his coat onto a chair and sank into the couch. She clammed up, he explained. Refused to say a word once we met in person. She was terrified. Said she got a threatening phone call earlier. She wouldn't even look me in the eye. Tom's shoulders slumped. So, that's another dead end? Stokes exhaled. Maybe not entirely. She hinted that Nick has some high-placed associates. She didn't say who, but I suspect it's local businessmen or officials. They're leaning on anyone who might speak up. They lapsed into silence. Tom realized that the path to justice was strewn with obstacles. Do we still have enough with the journal? He asked, voice trembling with uncertainty. Stokes studied him, then nodded slowly. It's powerful evidence, especially if we can get a handwriting expert to verify it's your father's. But to clinch a case like this, we often need corroborating witnesses or physical evidence that links Nick to your parents' disappearance. If we file charges prematurely and lose, Nick might walk free forever. Tom felt tears prickle the corners of his eyes, but he swallowed them down. Then what can we do? Stokes softened his tone. We keep digging. Investigations like this can take months. But I'm worried about you, Tom. Nick may accelerate his plans if he suspects we're building a case. Those words sank in. Tom could almost feel Nick's gaze on him, even though he was miles away. The sense of being hunted built a knot of fear in Tom's chest. He forced himself to breathe. I understand. We'll do whatever it takes. The next few days passed in an uneasy blur. Stokes came and went at odd hours, sometimes returning with new tidbits of information, a suspicious bank transaction, a real estate transfer. He noted everything carefully, building a file that seemed to grow thicker each night. Tom tried to be patient, but he felt like a prisoner in Stokes's bungalow. He rarely ventured outside, lest someone spot him. At one point, Harriet, the nurse from the hospital, reached out to Stokes, claiming she wanted to clarify some medical records regarding Tom's fall. Tom overheard the phone call. Apparently Harriet had become suspicious of how quickly Nick had taken control of Tom's medical decisions, even limiting who could visit him at the hospital. She also had glimpses of Tom's injuries that suggested an external force had caused the fall, though she wasn't a forensic specialist. It was another small piece of the puzzle, but not the smoking gun they needed. One overcast morning, Stokes received an unexpected call from a source at the city archives. That contact revealed that Nick had quietly filed to sell off parcels of the Porter estate to a foreign investor. If that went through, Nick stood to make a massive profit, one that was never authorized by Tom or anyone else with a legitimate claim. Stokes suspected it might be Nick's final move before skipping town, especially once the pressure of an investigation mounted. It was the break they needed. This might be our chance, Stokes told Tom, excitement creeping into his normally steady voice. If we can prove that Nick's sale is fraudulent, it'll bring official scrutiny. Then we can present the journal. The authorities will have to intervene. Tom felt a surge of relief. So how do we do that? Stokes began laying out a plan. They needed to intercept the final contract signing and present evidence that Nick had no right to sell the property. A hearing at the county clerk's office would finalize the sale. If Tom appeared with documented proof that he was the rightful heir, and had been kept in the dark, then the clerk might freeze the transaction. That would, At the very least, buy time to open a broader investigation. However, going to a public office carried huge risks. Nick could have people watching. Tom might be in direct danger. But Tom realized they had little choice. They had to act before the sale went through. Under the cover of early morning, they drove downtown. Tom wore a cap pulled low, trying to be inconspicuous. Stokes had set up a meeting with the county clerk, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Billings, who agreed to look over the property documents. She was efficient, flipping through the files with hawk-like precision. When she finished, her lips thinned. "These documents claim Nick Johnson is the legal guardian and trustee of the estate," she said. "But I see no mention of him having authority to sell the property outright without the ward's consent. Young man, are you Tom Porter?" "Yes, ma'am," Tom said, heart pounding. "I never gave him permission to sell any part of the estate." Ms. Billings's eyes narrowed. "That's irregular. I'll place a hold on the sale until we can clarify the ownership. Mr. Johnson won't be pleased, but that's not my concern. The law is the law." A wave of relief washed over Tom. They had, at least, blocked Nick's quick profit. Stokes thanked Ms. Billings. As they left the clerk's office, Tom thought he spotted a figure lurking near the corner of the hallway. Dark clothes, a cap. The figure quickly turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Tom's pulse raced. He wondered if Nick's watchers were here, seeing everything. Sure enough, within the hour, Nick Johnson called Stokes's phone. The detective let it ring, ignoring it, but the calls persisted. Finally, Stokes answered on speaker, with Tom listening silently. "Detective," Nick said, voice tight. "I know you've been meddling in my affairs. And I believe you have Tom with you. He belongs at home." Stokes remained calm. "Tom is under my protection. Your attempt to sell the property has been halted pending further investigation. I suggest you prepare to speak with the authorities." Nick let out a cold chuckle. "You have no idea what you've started. This estate is bigger than just you, me, or Tom. There are interests involved that you can't comprehend. If you think blocking one little real estate deal will stop us, you're mistaken. And detective, if you value Tom's life, you'll back off." A chill ran through Tom. The call ended abruptly. Stokes stared at the phone, tension etched into his features. "That was a threat," he said, voice grim. "This means we're close to unraveling something big." Tom swallowed. "What do we do now?" Stokes inhaled. "We escalate. I'll file for an official investigation into the finances, see if we can get a judge to sign off on a search warrant for the estate. With luck, they'll find records and evidence that back up your father's journal." Nick is rattled. That might make him dangerous, but also sloppy. The next week became a frantic dance of gathering evidence, consulting lawyers, and fending off Nick's attempts to discredit Tom. Newspapers started catching wind of a family scandal, though the details were murky. Tom stayed mostly hidden with Stokes, but every time the phone rang, or a car passed by the window too slowly, Tom's heart leapt into his throat. Finally, the day of the official hearing arrived. A judge would review the allegations regarding Nick's fraudulent activity, the suspicious disappearance of Tom's parents, and Tom's statement about being pushed. It was not a full criminal trial, but a preliminary step that could lead to Nick's arrest if the judge found enough cause. Stokes dressed in his best suit, determined to present the evidence clearly. Tom, wearing a borrowed jacket, clutched his father's journal like a talisman. They entered the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid the press. Inside, the corridors buzzed with activity. In the hearing room, they found Nick already seated at a table, flanked by two imposing attorneys. Nick's gaze met Tom's, and a flicker of fury passed across his features before he replaced it with a smug smirk. Tom's stomach churned. He clung to the hope that truth would prevail. The hearing began with formalities. Stokes presented a summary of the case: the suspicious nature of Tom's fall, the disappearance of Robert and Linda Porter, the existence of the journal detailing Nick's threats, and the newly uncovered financial improprieties. Nick's lawyers countered aggressively, dismissing Tom's claims as the fantasy of a traumatized youth. They hinted that Tom was manipulated by the detective, who had a personal vendetta, They questioned the authenticity of the journal, suggesting it might be forged. The room filled with tension. Tom tried to remain composed, though inside he boiled with anger at the sneering insinuations. When the judge finally asked Tom to speak, he rose on shaky legs. "I just want to know what happened to my parents," Tom said, voice trembling. "My father wrote that he feared for his life because of my uncle's actions. Then he vanished. I fell down the stairs, and I remember someone pushing me. I believe it was my uncle or someone working for him. That's why I ended up in a coma." Nick scoffed loudly. "This is outrageous. The boy has no proof I was even in the hallway." Tom turned to Nick, tears stinging his eyes. "You have the estate. You control everything. If it was an accident, why keep so many secrets? Why threaten the staff? Why replace everyone after my fall?" Nick's face hardened. One of his attorneys quickly interjected. "Objection, this is speculation. The staff changes are common in large estates." The judge asked for order. Moments later, Detective Stokes stepped forward with the journal. He provided analysis from a handwriting expert who verified the writing matched Robert Porter's known samples. He also produced references to Nick's suspicious financial maneuvers, including attempts to sell estate parcels without Tom's consent. The judge's expression grew more serious, the weight of the evidence making an impact. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that Nick's side was unprepared for the thoroughness of Stokes's investigation. Their initial bravado faltered under the journal's details and the bank statements. At one point, Nick hissed something to his lawyers, who nodded grimly. Then, to everyone's surprise, they requested a recess, claiming they needed time to gather more information. The judge allowed it, setting the next session for the following week. Meanwhile, the judge ordered Nick to refrain from any estate transactions and asked that Tom be placed under protective oversight pending the results of the investigation. Nick stormed out, flanked by his attorneys. He paused only long enough to glare at Tom. "You've made a grave mistake," he said quietly, so only Tom and Stokes could hear. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." Tom felt a wave of fear and nausea wash over him. Stokes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't listen to him," the detective whispered. "We're doing the right thing. He's cornered." They stepped outside into a swarm of reporters, cameras flashing. Stokes shielded Tom as best he could, and they hurried to a car waiting across the street. Once inside, Tom's hands shook. "What happens now?" Stokes sighed. "We wait for the next hearing. In the meantime, I suspect Nick will try something desperate. We have to stay vigilant." Tom nodded, eyes burning with exhaustion. Even though they had made significant progress, the sense of danger intensified. Nick's parting words echoed in his mind. Tom could not shake the feeling that the conflict was far from over. Sure enough, that very night, trouble found them. Stokes's phone rang near dusk. The call was from a blocked number. When Stokes answered, he heard a low voice. "Release the boy back to the estate," it demanded. "Stop this investigation, or you'll both regret it." Stokes replied calmly. "Is that a threat?" "You can call it what you want," the voice said. "We prefer to avoid unnecessary harm, but if you push us, we'll push back." Tom, listening from the couch, felt a chill. So Nick, or his associates, were done hiding behind attorneys. They wanted to frighten him into submission. Stokes ended the call with a scowl, slamming the phone down on the table. "They're not even subtle anymore," he said, looking at Tom with concern. "We have to assume they're capable of anything." The next days crawled by with oppressive tension. Stokes increased his vigilance, double-checking locks, scanning the street for suspicious cars. He rarely left Tom alone, and even then, only for short errands. The hearing date loomed. Nick's lawyers pushed to delay it, but the judge refused, insisting the matter be resolved promptly. On the evening before the scheduled hearing, Stokes got a surprise lead. A witness from Nick's circle wanted to come forward, claiming they possessed a letter from Robert Porter that detailed Nick's threats in explicit detail. It was the strongest piece of evidence yet, if it was genuine. The meeting was set for late at night in a deserted park, the witness insisting on secrecy. Stokes debated whether to bring Tom, finally deciding it was safer for Tom to stay at the bungalow. Tom locked the door behind Stokes, anxiety roiling in his gut. He disliked the idea of the detective going alone. As the hours ticked past and Stokes did not return, Tom's unease grew unbearable. Around midnight, a violent knock rattled the door. Tom's heart jumped. Carefully, he peered through the peephole. To his immense relief, it was Stokes, though the detective looked shaken. Tom opened the door. "What happened? Did you get the letter?" Stokes shook his head, entering with hurried steps. "It was a setup," he said, anger lacing his tone. "No one showed. Instead, I got cornered by two men who warned me off the investigation. I managed to slip away, but it was close. They threatened my life if I show my face at the hearing tomorrow." Tom's stomach lurched. "Are you okay?" Stokes gave a tight nod. "I'm fine. But this means Nick is desperate. He'll do anything to stop us from presenting our evidence." A quiet determination settled over Tom. "We can't let him scare us away. If we don't go to the hearing, he wins." Stokes exhaled. "I know. We'll be there. We just need to watch our backs." He studied Tom's face. "You look pale. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Tom tried to sleep but found it impossible. His mind drifted to memories of the estate. The day Nick arrived after Tom's parents vanished, claiming he would watch over everything. The hush that fell over the staff. The lonely dinners at a too-long table. Nick's controlling presence, always just in the background. Then the night of the accident, the fall, the terror, and the blackness of the coma. The next thing Tom remembered was the hospital, the nurse, and the shape of the detective in the corner. Now, at least, he was on the cusp of learning the truth and exposing the lies. Yet the danger never felt so real. When dawn came, Tom and Stokes prepared for the final hearing. Tom wore the same borrowed jacket. Stokes wore his suit, though this time he carried a look of grim resolve. They headed to the courthouse early, hoping to avoid an ambush. Once inside, they realized the tension had reached a boiling point. Reporters milled around the corridors, and security guards were posted at the entrances. Nick arrived with a scowl, Harold the caretaker trailing behind like a bodyguard. The hearing commenced. The judge asked if either side had new evidence. Nick's lawyers began by claiming the entire case was an attempt to smear Nick's name, that the journal was fake, and that Tom was confused. They demanded the hearing be thrown out. Detective Stokes stepped up, calmer than Tom had expected. He presented copies of the financial records, bank statements showing Nick's suspicious transactions, and a sworn statement from Harriet at the hospital, describing how Nick restricted Tom's visitors and insisted that the fall was an accident, even though Tom was only just regaining consciousness. Stokes highlighted that Harriet had overheard Nick talking to doctors about how Tom wouldn't remember a thing. Nick's attorneys tried to object, but the judge allowed the statement into the record. Tom held his breath. Then Stokes produced a final piece of documentation, records from a private investigator who discovered that Nick had insured Tom's life for a substantial sum, naming himself as the trustee of any payouts. Tom's blood ran cold at the revelation. Nick leapt to his feet. "This is slander. I only took out that policy to protect my nephew." The judge rapped the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Johnson." Nick's glare could have cut steel, but he complied. His attorneys scrambled to counter the damaging new information. They insisted the insurance policy was standard practice for guardians. Tom's nails dug into his palms. It was now or never. He rose and walked to the podium, the judge permitting him to speak directly. "My father wrote in his journal that he feared for his life because of Nick. Then my father vanished. My mother vanished. I truly believe Nick had something to do with it. When I woke from my coma, I said someone pushed me. I still believe that to be true. If I die, Nick gains everything. That's not a coincidence." Nick's voice boomed. "Stop spreading these lies. Where is the proof of my involvement in your father's disappearance?" Tom locked eyes with him. "We're still uncovering it. But the truth is coming to light. The judge conferred with a clerk, scanning through the documents. Then, to Tom's immense relief, the judge announced that there was sufficient cause to move toward a formal criminal investigation. Nick Johnson was to be detained for questioning on suspicion of fraud, possible involvement in the disappearance of Robert and Linda Porter, and conspiracy to commit harm against Tom. The attorneys clamored in protest, but the judge overruled them. Nick, seeing the writing on the wall, sprang up. Instead of surrendering quietly, he made a dash for the exit. 2 security guards attempted to intercept him. Harold lunged forward to block them, a scuffle breaking out in the aisle. Shouts echoed in the courthouse. Tom pressed himself against the wall as pandemonium erupted. Eventually, a group of guards wrestled Nick and Harold to the ground. Nick's outraged cries reverberated through the hall. After a chaotic few minutes, Nick was in handcuffs. The caretaker, Harold, was also restrained, though it was unclear if he would be charged. Nick cast a venomous glare at Tom. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You think you're safe, but there are others who wanted your parents gone. I'm just one piece of the puzzle." His words rattled Tom, reminding him that Nick might not have acted alone. Still, the immediate threat was contained. Stokes escorted Tom away from the spectacle, ensuring they avoided the throng of reporters outside. In the following days, law enforcement secured the estate and began searching it for additional evidence. Tom was allowed to return only under police supervision. He stood in the foyer, gazing at the grand staircase that had haunted his nightmares. A wave of emotion hit him as he relived that terrible moment. But this time, he felt a sense of power. This was his home, and he was no longer a helpless victim. Investigators combed every room. They discovered hidden compartments in the study containing false financial ledgers. They found documents indicating that Nick had made deals with corrupt officials, bankrolling them in exchange for silence. While the deeper conspiracy might take more time to unravel, Nick's own wrongdoing was enough to keep him in custody. At last, after weeks of intense legal proceedings, Nick Johnson was formally charged with fraud, conspiracy, and suspected involvement in the disappearance of Robert and Linda Porter. Although the case surrounding Tom's parents' fate remained open, detectives believed they now had enough leads to continue the search with renewed vigor. Tom, for his part, felt conflicted. He was relieved to see Nick behind bars, but Nick's ominous hints about a higher conspiracy lingered in his mind. The possibility that others had played a role in his parents' disappearance cast a long shadow. For the moment, though, he could breathe a small sigh of relief. Nick could not harm him anymore. When Tom finally stood in the estate's master bedroom, the room his parents once shared, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. He ran his fingers over the vanity table where his mother's perfume bottle still stood. Dust coated everything, a silent testament to the years of absence. A detective rummaged around, snapping photos, searching for any overlooked clues. Tom inhaled the stale air and made a quiet vow that he would not rest until he found out what truly happened to his parents, no matter how high the conspiracy reached. In the days that followed, Tom was able to address the staff who remained. Many of them were new hires, but a few older employees had started to come forward, relieved that Nick's intimidation was finally over. Some tearfully apologized for not speaking up sooner, explaining that Nick's threats had been too formidable. Tom forgave them. He understood the power Nick wielded. Detective Stokes remained by Tom's side, finalizing paperwork that would reinstall Tom as the estate's rightful occupant. The legal complexities were vast, but the path was clear. One evening, as they both paused in the hallway, Stokes turned to Tom. "You're incredibly brave, you know," Stokes said, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You risked everything to find the truth. And you never gave up." Tom forced a small smile. "I had help. And I couldn't live with the questions, not knowing why my parents vanished." Stokes nodded. "There's more for us to uncover, but you can move forward now. If you ever need anything, someone to talk to, or help with the investigation, I'm here." Emotion welled in Tom's chest. "Thank you," he managed, voice thick. "You've been more than a detective. You've been a real friend." They shared a moment of quiet understanding. Then Stokes cleared his throat, glancing around. Well, let's see if the rest of these rooms yield any more secrets. Over the next several weeks, the estate was thoroughly catalogued. Police discovered a hidden safe in the library, containing letters from Nick to unnamed associates, letters that alluded to strong-arm tactics and hush money. More charges were added to Nick's growing list of crimes. Meanwhile, Tom worked with a trusted lawyer to secure his inheritance, ensuring that Nick could not siphon off any more of the family's assets. Though the local papers reported on the dramatic downfall of Nick Johnson, they only grazed the surface of the conspiracy. Tom knew that the wheels of justice turned slowly. He kept in touch with Detective Stokes, who promised to keep investigating the possibility that others were involved in Robert and Linda Porter's disappearance. Still, without concrete leads, that part of the mystery remained unresolved. As the weeks passed, Tom found a sense of routine. He had the estate repaired, windows fixed, walls repainted, the creaking floorboards reinforced. A new caretaker was hired, carefully vetted by Stokes. For the first time since he awoke in the hospital, Tom felt that the estate was his home again, not a place of lurking dread. One morning, an officer informed Tom that Nick was finally going to trial. If convicted, he would face a lengthy sentence. "It's almost over," the officer said kindly. Tom thanked him, though he knew that "over" was a relative term. The memory of the push and the disappearance of his parents would never fade easily. But at least the man who had tried to destroy him was now in custody. That evening, Tom stood by the grand staircase, looking down from the top step. He felt the solidity of the banister under his palm. A swirl of sorrow and determination welled inside him. "I'm still here," he whispered to the empty hall. "You didn't win." He turned to see Detective Stokes watching from below. Stokes offered a reassuring nod. "You're stronger than you think, Tom," he said. Tom made his way down the steps, step by careful step, until he stood beside the detective. "I'm ready," he said. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." Over the next few days, the final legalities fell into place. Nick, from his jail cell, could do nothing but watch as the estate was rightfully secured in Tom's name. He was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, and the investigation into Tom's parents' disappearance remained open. Now that staff members felt safe to speak, testimonies piled up, painting a picture of Nick as a manipulative figure who had carefully orchestrated his hold on the estate for years. The last time Tom saw Nick face to face was in the courthouse. Nick was brought in under guard to deal with additional charges. He glared at Tom with unrestrained malice but said nothing. Part of Tom almost wanted to confront him again, to demand answers about his parents. But deep down, Tom sensed Nick would never reveal the full truth willingly. The legal system would have to pry it out, piece by piece. Afterward, Tom and Stokes exited the courthouse together. Reporters swarmed them with questions. Stokes politely declined interviews, guiding Tom to a waiting car. When they finally pulled away from the chaos, Tom let out a shaky breath. "I think I'm done with being in the spotlight," he said softly. Stokes smiled gently. "You've earned some peace." A few weeks passed. Autumn leaves began to turn gold on the estate grounds. The staff had transformed in spirit, no longer walking on eggshells around Nick's silent oppression. Tom spent his mornings in the library, poring over old family records, trying to piece together more about his parents. Detective Stokes occasionally stopped by, sometimes with small updates from the continuing investigation, sometimes just to say hello and share a cup of tea. Their friendship had blossomed from the shared trials, forming a bond that felt unbreakable. One crisp afternoon, Tom went for a walk in the estate gardens with Stokes by his side. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and the gentle crunch underfoot reminded Tom of simpler times. He glanced at Stokes, who carried a thoughtful expression. "You know," Tom said, "I used to run around here with my mom and dad. We'd laugh, chase each other among the hedges. Part of me always thought I'd have more time with them." Stokes's eyes flickered with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Tom. I really am. We still have leads to follow, though." "We're not done." Tom nodded. "I know. I wish I could have saved them somehow. If they're still alive, I wish I could find them. If they're not, I just want to know. Stokes placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. We'll keep searching. No matter how long it takes. They continued their walk in companionable silence, letting the hush of nature envelop them. For the first time, the estate no longer felt like a prison or a place of dread. It was Tom's rightful home, where he could honor his parents' memory and forge his future. His scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, but they no longer defined him. He had survived the fall, the coma, and the betrayal. He had emerged stronger. Eventually, they returned to the mansion. The evening light cast long shadows across the lawn. Tom stopped at the threshold and turned to Stokes. Stay for dinner? He offered. I'm not much of a cook, but the new chef makes a mean roast chicken. Stokes chuckled. I'd be honored. They dined in the smaller dining room, not the cavernous one that reminded Tom too much of lonely meals under Nick's watch. The new chef served them plates of aromatic chicken and vegetables. Tom ate with genuine appetite, a sense of normalcy finally settling in. He and Stokes discussed everyday matters, sports, local news, even jokes about Stokes's early detective blunders. Tom laughed more in that one evening than he had in months. When the meal was finished, Stokes leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach with satisfaction. That was excellent, he said. Glad to see you're being taken care of. Tom gave a relaxed grin. Feels good to just live without constantly looking over my shoulder. They ended the night in the library, sipping hot tea by the fireplace, an unspoken feeling of gratitude between them. Stokes eventually bid him good night, reminding Tom to call if he needed anything. As Tom watched him drive away, he felt a comforting warmth in his chest. Through all the turmoil, he had gained not just a mentor, but a true friend. The weeks blended into a season of healing and slow progress. Investigators kept Tom updated. Nick had pled not guilty, but the evidence was strong. A trial date was set for later that year. Meanwhile, bits of information trickled in about Nick's larger network, and the authorities were unraveling the chain of corruption one link at a time. Tom maintained a cautious hope that the deeper conspiracy Nick hinted at would be exposed in court. One final scene played out in the estate's courtyard. A police van arrived to collect some last items of evidence: old ledgers, computer hard drives, boxes from the hidden safe. Tom oversaw the process, ensuring every item was carefully logged. A detective turned to him with a nod. We'll see if these yield anything else useful, she said. Tom nodded. Thank you. I hope it helps bring closure. When the van pulled away, Tom stood by the courtyard's fountain, listening to the gentle trickle of water. Birds hopped along the fountain's edge, unafraid. The estate no longer felt oppressive. It breathed with renewed life. Tom closed his eyes, thinking about how far he had come, literally from a coma to this moment, where justice felt tangible. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Detective Stokes approaching. The older man offered a small smile. They'll lock up Nick for a long time, he said. And if there's anyone else involved, we'll find them. Tom exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for ages. I believe you, he replied. In the quiet twilight, they walked back inside together. Though the final answers about Tom's parents might take years, or might never fully emerge, Tom had reclaimed his home, his life, and most importantly, his sense of self. He was no longer the helpless boy on the staircase. He was Tom Porter, resilient heir of the Porter estate, standing tall in the face of darkness. All that remained was the slow, necessary process of rebuilding. Over the subsequent months, Tom renovated the estate's neglected corners, opened up the gardens to local community events, and even hosted a small gathering of neighbors, something unthinkable under Nick's reign. Stokes dropped by regularly, helping Tom navigate the complexities of running a large property. They exchanged stories, developed a deeper bond, and became a family of sorts, forged by adversity. Through it all, Tom never stopped searching for answers about his parents. He pored over old diaries, questioned staff members, and followed leads that sometimes turned into dead ends. Though he never found the definitive proof of their fate, each discovered clue became a piece of a puzzle he vowed to complete one day. He found solace in the knowledge that Nick Johnson, the man who had tried to steal everything from him, was behind bars awaiting a trial that looked more damning by the day. The caretaker, Harold, had confessed to certain misdeeds under Nick's influence, though Harold claimed he did not know the full extent of Nick's plans. Charges were pending. The justice system was slowly grinding forward, giving Tom a sense that the circle was closing around all those who had conspired to harm his family. Then came the final word. Nick was found guilty of multiple financial crimes, including fraud and embezzlement. The question of Tom's parents remained unresolved in the courtroom, but the judge acknowledged the suspicious circumstances and recommended further criminal investigation. When the sentence was handed down, Nick's expression was a mix of rage and disbelief. He was led away, still proclaiming his innocence, still muttering dark warnings about others who would finish what he started. Tom stood in the back of the courtroom, flanked by Stokes. They watched Nick disappear through the door that led to holding cells. An era of terror ended in that moment, replaced by an enduring, if bittersweet, sense of justice. Later that evening, back at the estate, Tom ascended the grand staircase with steady footsteps. He reached the top and looked down, remembering the moment that had nearly claimed his life. "You tried to take everything from me," he murmured. "But I'm still here." He ran a hand over the banister, then turned and continued to his room, shutting the door softly behind him. In the weeks that followed, Tom's life settled into a new rhythm. He pursued his education, with Stokes helping arrange private tutors. Friends from the local community began to visit, and Tom slowly learned how to be a teenager again, free from constant fear. Each morning he woke, he no longer felt the bruises of the fall. His body was healing, and his mind, while scarred by trauma, was also on a path to recovery. One late afternoon, Tom and Stokes sat in the estate's library, sipping tea as the sun's rays slanted through tall windows. Tom closed the ledger he'd been studying. "I guess the rest of the conspiracy might be out there," he said, meeting Stokes's gaze. "But for now, at least I can breathe again." Stokes nodded. "You've done more than breathe, Tom. You've fought back, reclaimed your life. Your parents would be proud." Tom's throat tightened. He pictured his father's gentle smile, his mother's warm laugh. For the first time in a long while, the memory brought comfort, not just sadness. "Thank you," he said. "You've been with me through it all. You saved me." Stokes shook his head, smiling. "You saved yourself? I just helped a bit." They chuckled softly, a shared moment that spoke volumes about their friendship. Night fell, and the mansion's lights flickered on, illuminating the paths outside. The estate felt peaceful, an oasis after the storm of betrayal and violence. Eventually, Stokes stood to leave, but paused at the library door. "Take care of yourself, Tom," he said. "I'll be by tomorrow to check in." Tom grinned. "I'll be here." As Stokes's footsteps retreated, Tom leaned back in his chair, thinking about how drastically his life had changed since the day he woke in the hospital. He had pieced together a truth that many wanted to remain buried. He had faced down a man who nearly succeeded in taking everything from him. And though the ultimate fate of his parents remained shrouded, he was no longer alone in that quest. He ran his hand over the smooth wooden surface of the table beside him. The fight had cost him so much, his sense of innocence, months of torment, countless sleepless nights. Yet he had gained something invaluable, knowledge of his own strength, and a bond with the detective who had stood by him through it all. He had glimpsed the darkness that lurked behind wealthy facades and learned that truth came at a price. But it was a price he was willing to pay. Tom stood, picking up a small lamp to guide his way through the corridors. The estate was vast, but it no longer intimidated him. Each corner, each room, felt like a piece of his identity that he was reclaiming from the shadows. The hush of night welcomed him. He passed the locked study, now unlocked, thoroughly searched, a testament to what had been uncovered. Soon, it would become a normal room again, filled with memories and hopefully, with new life as Tom rebuilt. He made his way upstairs, pausing once more at the top of the staircase. He peered over the railing into the echoing space below. A final wave of memory washed over him, of how it felt to be pushed, the moment of helplessness in midair, the crushing impact. Then, with a deep breath, Tom Porter let that memory settle into the past. He was no longer a victim. He was free to shape the future. In the quiet of his room, he pulled the sheets back, lying down with the lamp turned low. The events of the day, the weeks, the months, everything swirled in his mind, yet the edges softened. He allowed the soothing hush of the estate to cradle him. As his eyes closed, a single thought comforted him: the truth, at least a large part of it, had finally come to light. And for the first time since he woke up in the hospital, Tom Porter slept without terror, knowing that dawn would bring not fear, but a new day brimming with possibility. Nick Johnson remained in custody, awaiting trial on multiple charges, his reputation ruined, his crimes laid bare. The estate was once again under rightful ownership, safe from the greed that had gnawed at it. Tom Porter, though still young, had become a living testament to resilience and courage. The fight had been hard fought, the cost dear, but in the end, justice had prevailed, at least in that corner of the grand tapestry of corruption. Tomorrow might bring new revelations, new battles, but tonight, Tom Porter slept in peace, and that was victory enough for one life-altering journey. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.